The Supermarine Spitfire Mk.Vb was a later development on the Spitfire Mk.I, featuring improved engine and armament, seeing service with a number of nations during the Second World War in a variety of theatres. Hello everyone, I'm Matt, this is Model Minutes, and join me today as I build and review the PM model Spitfire Mk.Vb/C in 1/72nd scale, a kit which will transpire to be possibly one of the worst Spitfires I've ever built, as it's not a particularly well detailed model and it does have some questionable inaccuracies. Something I do wish I had when I was building this kit was a way to add some extra details, which leads me on to today's sponsor, Be-Izzy. Be-Izzy produces high quality riveting tools to add that extra level of detail to your scale models. Each one is handmade in the Czech Republic, and currently there are 15 different sizes to choose from, making them suitable for a wide range of scales. Not only do they have single wheel riveters, but double and triple wheel examples too. Each tool is comfortable to use and produces neat rivet marks in the surface of your plastic models. So check out the link in the description to find out more about how you can get your hands on these. Thanks to Be-Izzy for sponsoring this video. Now back to the Spitfire. For a closer look inside the box at the contents of the kit, take a look at the dedicated unboxing video I made on that topic. I will put a list of the products I used during this build on the screen now though, to give you an idea of the kind of things you might want to go out and get if you feel like giving this one a go for yourself. I feel like I'm going to do this one as a bit of a back to basics kind of build, so no fancy airbrushing, just using good old fashioned hairy sticks to complete this one. As usual though, I'm going to cut the parts away from the sprue using either my side cutters or a knife, and then I'll sand away the various rough areas of plastic and flash with a sanding stick. Virtually every part in this kit has flash on it, so this was a time-consuming part of the build. So first up, I'm going to use some Humbrol poly cement. This is just the stuff from the tube. It's a little bit thicker than normal, but I thought it would be quite appropriate to use it on the propeller assembly. So there is a retaining part which goes onto the main axle, then a small amount of glue was added, and then the back part was added onto this. The idea here being that the middle part should freely rotate, but I think that's being optimistic because mine didn't in the end. Humbrol liquid poly was next to be used. I'm using this because I need to save my other better quality cements for other builds, and this was used on the front of the fuselage where the propeller gets mounted in, just a small amount to glue in the propeller assembly that we've already assembled. Now I'm going to get some paint on the model. So first up is this Humbrol Gen 2 acrylic paint. I have done a review both using airbrush and brush painting for these Gen 2 paints, which you can find on my channel. This cockpit green was applied straight out of the bottle into the internal fuselage areas. However, I didn't wash the plastic parts, and you can notice that the paint isn't wanting to stick so well. So perhaps washing the plastic parts to remove any mold release may have helped with this issue. But nonetheless, I persevered and got to where I needed to be. With that done, I joined the two fuselage halves together. You're probably wondering, but Matt, what about the cockpit internal details? Well, there aren't any, so yeah, this is pretty much a quick build. The wings come moulded in two parts, that's to say, each wing is one part. Normally you get an upper and a lower component which you join together. They do have these plugs which go into the wings, but I found that when I joined them using these plugs, they weren't aligned at all. So I decided the best thing to do would be to cut these plugs off and then sand them down, and then just use the rough surfaces to join the two parts together. That being said though, the joins between the wings are not perfect, and you can see that the wings are ever so slightly larger than the area where they join the fuselage, so not particularly the best design of kit. Nevertheless, I carried on, and having joined both wings to the aircraft, I left them to sit so the glue could cure. Next, this was followed by the tail surfaces. Again, I've removed the little plugs or mounting points purely because they just weren't aligned correctly, and I feel like doing it this way means that I can get a better alignment. Flipping over to the other side, we can now add on our air intakes and radiators. So these simply glue into their little holes on the bottom. The locating is pretty easy, but the parts themselves are a little bit questionably molded. There is a bit of a sink mark on this smaller oil radiator on the right hand side of the screen, but generally they go into place without any issues. Following this, a little bit more of the Humbrol liquid poly was added onto the bottom of the fuselage, and then the tail wheel was pressed into place in its little hole in this position. The cockpit canopy has been masked using my normal method, which is to apply tape and then carefully cut it in the right areas. The moulded frames though are virtually non-existent, so I pretty much had to guess where they were. Some Humbrol clear fix was then used to glue this cockpit canopy into place. I applied the clear fix using a cocktail stick, taking care to make sure those stringy bits of glue didn't get in the wrong places. The canopy was then carefully positioned. The final step before doing some painting was to install the aerial mast in its hole behind the cockpit. Humbrol No. 1 acrylic primer, this is a nice grey colour, was then used on the entire aircraft and a few of the pieces which I've not yet applied to the model. This should help give a good base for any of the subsequent paints that I'm going to apply, helping them to stick to the surface properly. First up, some Humbrol acrylic No. 34 matte white was thinned down with some acrylic thinner. There was no real ratio for this, I pretty much just put the paint in and some thinner just until I got the consistency I was looking for, which wasn't overly thin but was thin enough to let it spread out onto the model and not leave any brush strokes. So the first bits I'm painting with this colour are the tips of the wings and also the spinner that goes on the nose. They're not going to remain white, but it is going to form a base layer for the next colour. Humbrol 174, which is a signal red colour, was then applied on top of the areas I've previously painted white. It was thinned down ever so slightly with a little bit of acrylic thinner just to prevent any brush marks being visible when the paint dries. But the white paint should provide a good base layer to allow this red paint to be nice and vibrant. A few thin coats would be needed to get a uniform finish. Next up was this Humbrol Gen 2 157 Matte Azure Blue, and I'm not entirely sure how I feel about this paint. Having done a couple of reviews with it now, I found it to be sort of thin. It did have pigments in it which are quite visible. It is a bit of a grainy paint, but I had this paint and I thought, why not use it to give it a fair test on a live build. Now for the top colour, I've decided to go for this Tamiya Dark Yellow XF60, which I thinned down with some of Tamiya's X20A thinner. Being alcohol based, I thought it best to use an alcohol based thinner for this paint. This was applied to all of the top areas not previously painted, acting as the dark yellow part of the camouflage scheme and a base layer for the brown, which will come a little bit later. A couple of thin coats would be needed to get uniform finish with this paint, and I took special care to make sure it didn't go into the places I've already painted with the azure blue and the red on the wingtips. I didn't bother masking that, I just did that carefully with the brush. The dark earth was Humbrol Gen 2 number 29, and this was thinned ever so slightly with some of the Humbrol acrylic thinners and then carefully applied using a thin tipped brush to the areas where the camouflage scheme would be. I pretty much just did this by hand and used the artwork in the instructions as a guide. I'd go around the outside of the camouflage areas with the paint and then fill in the centres with some more. I did find that I had to go over this area at least twice with this paint to get a uniform colour of this dark earth. And with all those paint layers dry, this gloss varnish from Vallejo was thinned down with a little bit of water, and then using a large, wide, flat brush, I applied it to the entire aircraft in preparation for the decals, which will come in the next step. This gloss varnish layer should form a nice smooth surface for the decals to stick to. And speaking of the decals, you get 3 different decal schemes in this one. I've decided to go for the RAF version because I think it's a little bit more interesting. They were carefully cut into more manageable strips, and then some microscale liquid decal film was brushed onto the top of the transfers I was going to use. I think that PM transfers are generally okay, but I have had some bad experiences in the past, so I thought the best thing to do would be to apply this decal film to these decals so that they didn't disintegrate when put in water. Which, coincidentally, when that decal film was dry, was the next step. I dipped the transfer sheet into water and then would put it on some paper towel to allow the excess water to be blotted away and the moisture allow the transfers to release from the paper. So Humbrol Decal Fix will be used as my setting solution in this build, and it was applied to the model in the areas where the transfers were going to go. The transfers were then carefully moved off of the backing paper and positioned on the model with a little bit of fiddling with their position to make sure they were in the right places. Once they were in the right places, some more decal fix was applied over the top to further soften them into the surface of the plastic. When all the transfers had completely cured, some Vallejo matte varnish was thinned down with some water, and just as before when we did the gloss, it was applied to the entire model. This should help protect the transfers, seal them into the surface, and also bring down that glossy shine and make it more uniform. Now to begin work on those details not yet applied to the model. Humbrol acrylic number 33 matte black was carefully added to the tyres on the wheels and onto the propeller blades on the nose of the aircraft. I used a fine brush to try and avoid getting the paint in the wrong places. After this, some Humbrol 53 gunmetal grey was carefully applied to the engine exhausts, which have yet to be added onto the model. Normally I try and make these look a little bit rusty, but I think for a basic build this will do for now. Up next is Humbrol 99 Matte Lemon, which is a nice vibrant yellow colour. This was carefully painted onto the tips of the propeller blades. On RAF aircraft they tended to paint the tips of the propeller blades with a little bit of yellow just to indicate to the ground crew where the dangerous spinny part was. Interestingly, on this model there is a little line which is moulded onto the plastic of the propeller tip to tell you where to put it. Up next is Humbrol 11, which is a silver colour. This was very carefully applied to the landing gear legs, which are moulded onto the doors. You can see that the insides of the doors have already been painted with the azure blue as used on the underside earlier. I'd also used this silver on the hubs of the wheels. I decided to use this Humbrol 11 silver to do a bit of very simple chipping. A small amount of this paint was added onto a paintbrush, almost like dry brushing but just a little bit more wet, and then it was carefully stippled onto various areas around the wing roots and other parts of the aircraft where some wear and tear may be present. This is to give the impression that the paint has flaked away due to excessive wear, damage or use. I then also used the black paint from earlier to do some very simple weathering to simulate smoke and oil streaks. So a small amount of paint was applied to the brush, and then working in the direction of airflow, particularly around the gun ports and the engine, I would apply some of this dry brushed weathering. Now the final details can be added. The spinner was glued into position on the nose of the aircraft, and then this was followed by gluing the wheels onto the legs of the landing gear. The axle does protrude quite a long way through this, and I decided to leave it, but you could cut it off if you wanted to. The landing gear was then glued into the holes on the bottom of the model, and finally I glued in the engine exhausts in their holes on the nose. The ultimate step to complete this model was to carefully remove all the masking tape around the cockpit canopy, and with that I'm calling my back to basic build of the PM Spitfire Mk.Vb/C in 1/72 scale complete. So let's talk a little bit about the kit. I think as we've been going through the video, you may have drawn the same sort of conclusions as me, and on the whole, this is a model which, when built, looks pretty much like a Spitfire. That being said though, there are definitely some inaccuracies, especially regarding the shape. Towards the nose it looks a bit thin, whilst down the fuselage it also looks to be very overly thin and a bit tall. The canopy seems to be a little bit too small for what it really is, and then you have the wings. The wings don't really join the fuselage at the same size. That is to say, they are larger than the fuselage wing roots, which is a bit of a shame. The details that we have are generally quite crude and simplistic. The raised panel lines are a relic of an older time, and there isn't anything really in the way of rivet detail. On the landing gear there, you can see that the axles extend massively too far through the tyres, and I decided to leave it like that to highlight that point. I think it's also worth mentioning that the version I've done here is for a Spitfire Mk.Vb, and the Mk.Vb had 2 cannons and 4 machine guns, but you can see the stubs for the second cannon for the C-wing. That means that you should really have sanded that off to represent a Mk.Vb, but that isn't referenced at all in the instructions when building this kit. The absolute lack of anything inside the cockpit as well is a bit laughable. To be brutally honest, I would have liked to have seen a pilot. Some kits of this sort of genre or age would have come with a pilot figure, but this one just doesn't have it. And that being said, it doesn't have anything at all. Not a seat, not a control panel, absolutely nothing. You've just got a void in there. On the underside, you could have the landing gear in a raised position if you wanted to, and the way that you would do this is by simply not gluing in the landing gear as represented here. You just leave those parts off. On the bottom of the wing, you'll see there are no landing gear bays, and the reason for that is because the landing gear is moulded on in a raised position on the bottom. A very strange choice for a kit that, well, supposedly is fairly recent. What was it, about 2017 for this version? Yes. Again, this indicates to a model of a much older vintage. On the whole, the mould quality suffers slightly from the amount of flash that I had to remove, but it does build up fairly quickly given the low number of parts. I did, however, find, as discussed in the video, that I had to cut off a lot of the tabs for the wings and the tailplane because they simply don't line up correctly if you use them, and you will need to rejig and move things around. Eagle-eyed viewers might be able to spot a few areas where I neglected to bother putting extra work into the kit, and that would be on sanding the seams where they join together. Generally the seams aren't that bad, but there are some gaps as well which could have required filler around the wing roots. Just something for you guys to be aware of if you fancy having a go at this one for yourself. And there are a couple of reasons why you may want to go and get one of these for yourself. Firstly, it's not an expensive kit. Retailing for around £5.50 here in the UK, that's a fairly pocket money price. Given the fact it only has 21 parts, this means that you can make quick progress over a day or two. Additionally, it comes with 3 paint schemes, so you're getting quite good value for your money. The decals are of a usable quality. I did add that extra decal film on the top just to protect them, but I'm pretty sure that they will work without it. However, some of the printing is a little bit questionable and the registration is a little bit off. You might be able to notice there that the red in the centre of the white roundel parts are a little bit off to one side, which is a bit of a shame. But getting 3 decal schemes in a kit for £5.50 is quite a good deal. So if you were looking for a kit to knot together in an afternoon, or as a test build to try out new techniques and new products, then this kind of low money, pocket money build would be ideal for this. However, if you want a detailed model of a Spitfire, this is probably not the one I would recommend. Granted, you will have to pay a little bit more. For example, the Airfix Spitfire Mk.Vb, which is a more recent tooling, does retail for around £12, which is effectively double, and it only comes with 2 paint schemes. However, as mentioned, it is a much more accurate model kit. And sometimes I suppose it depends on the individual modeller's choices on what they want to do as to whether they can justify that cost. So why, in a nutshell, do I think that this is a bad model kit? I think ultimately it is due to the fact that it is a relic of its age. I went into more detail on this in my unboxing video, so it's definitely worth checking that one out if you haven't already done so. But it was led to believe that this was a 1982 tooling from a different company, which was Pioneer 2. However, I actually think it's older than that and is based off of, or at the very least a copy of, the 1959 Frog tooling. So yeah, this is an incredibly old model if that is true, and I think it definitely shows given today's standards. So let's talk a little bit about the products that I used then. Having used the Humbrol Gen 2 acrylics in only a test sense previously in my videos on my channel, what do I think of them having used them in this build? Well, I think that on the whole they seem to have performed relatively well, but they do seem a little bit thinner than previous versions of Humbrol paint, needing a couple of thin layers to build up the thickness of the paint. I'm not sure as well that the colours are completely accurate. If we compare it to the P40 that I did previously, this was all painted with Vallejo, you can see that the colours I've used aren't quite the same. Dark Earth is a little bit washed out. That could be due to the fact that it's got the Tamiya yellow underneath it, but the Azure Blue doesn't quite match. The Azure Blue on the bottom of the Spitfire is a little bit lighter and a little bit more purpley. Additionally, I found the Azure Blue to still be a bit grainy and not leave the most smooth of surfaces. The metallic colours such as the 11 and the 53, so the 11 is the silver I used for the chipping effect and the 53 is the gunmetal I used on the exhaust, they're not particularly vibrant either. They don't look as metallic as they probably should do, and they feel a little bit thin. So yeah, not my favourite metallic paints to use to date. But yeah, I think I've covered off all of the main points I wanted to talk about in this build, and I think it's probably time to sum this one up here. This Spitfire Mk.Vb/C kit from PM Model is a pocket money kit which has some good value in the respects that you get 3 transfer schemes. However, it is a very crude and low quality kit, which does betray the fact that it seems to be quite a vintage tooling dressed up in a fairly recent box. Perfect for those of us who want to have a fun little side build where we can try out new skills and techniques, but for those who are looking for an accurate representation of a Spitfire Mk.V, this isn't the one for you. I hope you enjoyed my back to basics build of this model kit though, and let me know down in the comments what you thought of my finished results. As always, quick shout out to my patrons and channel members for the extra support they give the channel. For more information on how you can join these guys on screen, take a look at the links in the description. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome my latest YouTube channel members to the club. These are Paul Bolton, Barbarous, Hobby Time, Doc Brown Scale Models, Kaz, Ashley Beavis, Ryan Scale Model World, DJ Cannon, World War II Scale Models, Laserbomb 54, Phil, LPJ Models, and Marcus. Welcome to the club, and a massive thanks to Crazy Loca and Calibear who donated those memberships to them. There are, alternatively, other ways you can help support the channel, and once again, full information is linked down in the description. However, if you're new here, clicking that subscribe button and turning notifications on will mean you never miss a modelling upload. Once again, thanks to Be Izzy for sponsoring this video, and don't forget to check their link in the description if you want some of their riveting tools. And finally, the last thing to say is a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you on the workbench again next time.